sticking with the Best Man Fellowship as well. I'm down in the basement. It's about the only quiet place where I can do this and not wake up children. It's kind of funny going from a place of wanting to wake them up as early as possible to get everything ready to now just letting them sleep as long as they will. Um, hey, Paul, is it okay if I just sit next to the treadmill while it runs the 5K? I could use 30 minutes to just stare at this floor, if that's allowable.
Don't forget to register. Just register, okay. Josh. That's all you need to do.
Register.
You'll get a t-shirt.
Yeah. So we're going to dig into Mark chapter 12 here. And if you've been sticking with us, then you know we're getting near kind of the end of the gospel where we've only got a couple of chapters left. And this chapter 12 actually kind of, it is basically the end of Jesus's public ministry here. We've kind of made the turn. The first 7 or 8 chapters or so, if you remember, he was really focused on ministering to the people, sharing the good word, spreading the gospel, healing, all that sort of stuff. And then we kind of make this turn. He says he's going to move, sets his face towards Jerusalem. And we have this kind of long march toward the cross where everything that Jesus is doing, the crucifixion, is kind of at the forefront of his mind. And then this last chapter here, chapter 12, is really the end of his public ministry. Everything after this is going to be kind of, chapter 13 is really a long apocalypse, and then we get to the crucifixion. So just wonderful themes coming up for those of us who feel like we are living in the end times. We'll be looking at how Jesus deals with that in the last few chapters here as we close out the gospel. But today we're looking at chapter 12, and it kind of breaks into 6 sections. We open with a kind of a parable, and then there's 4 questions that we kind of get to see Jesus respond to in succession. And then we close out with a scene in the temple that really, I think, is kind of a mirror to the opening parable here. So let's take a look. If I've got the new international version that I'm reading from this morning. But if whatever version you have, you can turn to Mark chapter 12, and we'll kind of go through this verse by verse here. So the first 12 verses. Jesus then began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a pit for the wine press, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What then will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Haven't you read this passage of Scripture? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Then the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders looked for a way to arrest him, because they knew that Jesus had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the crowd, so they left and went away. So kind of this theme continues here where Jesus is further elevating this conflict that he knows exists between him and the Jewish leaders. And he picks this really popular motif of a vineyard that everybody in the crowd, everybody in the audience would have been very familiar with. This was a theme kind of first raised by Isaiah, who's in the Jewish tradition. They don't even really refer to Isaiah as Isaiah. They refer to Isaiah as the prophet. So Isaiah was kind of the voice that everybody would have known the stories that Isaiah told, the warnings that Isaiah gave. And in the 5th chapter of Isaiah, he paints this picture of really kind of what we're seeing here in this first part of the chapter 12 of Mark here, where he says that Israel is a vineyard. God plants the vineyard, and the vineyard is Israel. And God tends to the vineyard and visits the vineyard and walks in the vineyard. And is hoping the vineyard will produce good fruit, but the vineyard only produces wild or rotten fruit. And so this is kind of Isaiah's way of saying that, Israel, you had a purpose. You were supposed to produce good fruit. You have turned into something that was not intended. And so the punishment in Isaiah 5 is God essentially opens the gates to the vineyard and lets the wild animals come in and devour the fruit. And that would have been symbolic of, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, some of these other empires that came in and conquered Israel and destroyed the temple and exiled the people. And so everybody, when Jesus talks about a vineyard, they would have already been thinking about this image that Isaiah painted, and especially living basically in a time when the latest wild animal, the Romans, has come in and is slowly devouring the fruit of Israel as well. But Jesus kind of alters things a little bit. Instead of the vineyard being Israel, in Jesus's parable, the vineyard really is kind of creation, or the kingdom of heaven, if you want to think of it that way. And Israel is the tenants, the stewards who have been kind of put in charge of taking care of creation. You can think all the way back to the second chapter of Genesis, where God creates Adam, and the first really kind of purpose that Adam is given, the first commandment Adam is given, is to be in the garden and to till it and care for it and keep it and make it flourish and grow and produce fruit. So this is the image that Jesus begins to paint, is that there's creation. God has planted creation, planted the kingdom of heaven. He's put Israel in charge of taking care of it. But what's happening? Well, when the vineyard is producing fruit and the tenants are supposed to give the first fruits back to the owner or to share it with others, they're withholding it. And so one after another, a slave comes to basically chastise the tenants, chastise the stewards for not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're beating the slaves. They're killing the slaves, which is kind of symbolic, really, of all of the prophets who have come to Israel in the past and tried to warn Israel that you're not living the way God has intended you to live. Finally, of course, we get to the very obvious symbol of the son. The owner says, well, I have a son, I'll send the son. Surely they will listen to my son. The son obviously is Jesus, who is kind of putting himself into this parable and saying, even I have come, and you are going to eventually kill me. And so the judgment is a little bit different here. Whereas in Isaiah, the judgment is the gates are opened and the vineyard is devoured by wild animals. Here, Jesus says the judgment is those of you who were given the kingdom, those of you who were given creation to care for it and keep it, you're going to be destroyed, and the vineyard's going to be given to somebody else. And again, I said we'll see that kind of at the end of this chapter, an example of how, at least in Jesus's mind, the kingdom of heaven is being given from those who had been charged with caring for it and who did a poor job of it to it's being given to other people. So, and then Jesus kind of switches metaphors really quickly. He goes from talking about a vineyard to talking about a building. He says that he picks up this verse from the Psalms and says that the stone that was rejected is now the cornerstone. And this is something, unless you're in the construction industry, and I don't even know that it would register for the construction industry anymore, but the idea was, you collected all these stones, and oftentimes there would be one stone that was kind of misshapen. It didn't really fit in the wall. It didn't fit anywhere in the building, but there was a place kind of at the top of the arch because of the way the keystone or the cornerstone was built. The top of the arch, it would end up going there and becoming the most important stone that kind of held the archway or held the building together. And so Jesus is kind of mixing these two metaphors here and saying, basically, everyone who was in charge of building this temple, building this kingdom, caring for this vineyard has done a bad job. Your leadership is being removed and it's being given to someone else. And so you can imagine that, and as we see here in the last verse of that section there, this didn't really sit very well with the leaders, the chief priests, the elders, the teachers of the law. This is kind of Jesus, another jab at them, another dig at them, kind of just elevating this conflict more and more. And moving us closer and closer to the cross. And so then we move into, this crowd is gathered, and we move into kind of these 4 successive questions here that I want to spend most of the time with this morning. we see this first attempt here to really, in the final attempt, to kind of arrest Jesus for the chaos that he's creating with his teaching and the crowds that are following him. And they send Pharisees and Herodians to basically put Jesus in a position where they hope that he's either going to lose his following or get arrested. This is, as Admiral Akbar would say, right? It's a trap. This is not people coming to really learn anything from Jesus. They're not coming to get into a debate about the wisdom of of God's kingdom with them. They're really coming to put him in a position where he's going to lose no matter what he says. So how do they do that? Well, they ask him, if we turn here to verse 13, and you can read along, this is a really short section here. The Pharisees and the Herodians were sent to Jesus to catch him in his words, or essentially to trap him. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. So is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought him the coin and he asked them, "Whose image is this? Whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him. So they bring up this question about taxes, which, by the way, the good news for us right now is tax day has been extended by 3 months. If you didn't know that, you can delay it even further, because I know that that's probably not at the top of your mind right now. But they bring this idea of taxes. This was something on the mind of even the Jews 2,000 years ago, especially living in Jerusalem. There would have been a number of taxes that they were responsible for. There was the temple tax, there was the tax for the poor, and now with the Roman oppression, there's the imperial tax, or Caesar's tax. So taxes were as big an issue then as they are for us now. And they bring up this question: is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Well, how is this a trap? Because basically, if Jesus says, yes, you should pay the taxes, then what he's saying is this Roman occupation of God's people is okay. And so you should be a part of it. You should participate in it and pay the tax. Well, that's going to alienate these crowds of Jews that have been following him, that have been thinking this is the one who's going to free us from the Roman oppression. If Jesus says, no, you shouldn't pay the tax, well, then all of the Roman soldiers who are kind of following this gathering to make sure that it doesn't turn into a rebellion are going to hear that as words of rebellion, that no, you shouldn't pay the tax. You shouldn't do what Caesar's asking you to do. You should stand firm and protest this. So they've put Jesus, they think, in this position where if he says yes or no, regardless, he's going to lose something big. He's either going to lose his following or he's going to lose his life. But as we've seen before, whenever Jesus is put into a corner, he is kind of this master jujitsu artist, and he takes the energy that is being sent to him to bring him down, and he kind of turns it and uses it back against those who are questioning him. And that's what he does here when he asks for a coin to be presented. What this is doing essentially, and Jesus, I think it says there that Jesus knew their hypocrisy. Jesus is basically catching the Pharisees and the Herodians in this hypocrisy that they themselves are participants in the empire of Rome. Because when he says, well, he kind of plays dumb and says, well, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. Does anybody have a Roman coin? Well, if you were really a good, faithful Jew, then you didn't carry Roman money with you. You carried the money of Israel around with you. And so when Jesus asks to see a coin, he's basically has turned the trap around on the Pharisees and the Herodians, who dig through their pockets, and what do you know? Their pockets are full of Roman money. This is kind of like, a good analogy that I thought of is kind of that joke about the people who are sitting around talking about all the injustices of labor laws around the world, and labor inequality and all these things, and child labor laws. And somebody asks, well, how do you know about all this injustice? And everybody pulls out their Apple iPhones to show the information. Well, it's like, well, if you're carrying products from companies that are treating their workers poorly to find out about this injustice. Well, you're a participant in that, right? And this is really it's a good reminder to all of us every time that maybe we feel worked up about some sort of issue. Perhaps rather than going after people, the first question should be asked of ourselves, well, how am I participating in this thing that so upsets me anyways? Do I have in my pockets, do I have Roman coins as I'm complaining about the imperial tax? So that's really the first thing that Jesus does in his response, is he reveals this hypocrisy of the people who are asking the questions, who have to produce these coins. Because if you notice, Jesus doesn't really ever seem to carry money at all. So he is he's really kind of transcends this whole argument. And that's really what he does here in his explanation when they bring the coin out to him. And he says, well, whose image is there on the coin? And they say, it's Caesar's image. And he says, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. What he's really kind of alluding to here in this response is these two ideas that I think pretty much everybody in the crowd would have picked up on. The first, when he talks about whose image is on the coin, well, if you remember from your Old Testament commandments, the third commandment is to have no idols and to make no graven images. So in the culture of in the Jewish culture, they weren't even allowed to carve out pictures of people, because that essentially was breaking the third commandment. It was creating a graven image that might become an idol. So when Jesus says, well, whose image is there? He's showing them that by carrying these coins around, they're breaking one of God's laws. They're breaking one of the commandments by participating in something that has set up Caesar as an idol. And then he says, well, render to Caesar's what is Caesar's. Obviously, if it's got Caesar's picture on it, it belongs to Caesar. But give to God what is God's. Now, what is he doing here? Is he's going back even further than Moses and the commandments here, back to Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, where the scriptures say that we have been created with an image imprinted on us. And whose image is that? It's God's. So we are image bearers of God, just like that coin bears the image of Caesar. Well, that must belong to Caesar. What Jesus is doing is he's saying, but you bear the image of God. Each one of you has God's image printed on yourself, on your heart. And so your duty is first and foremost to give to God what is God's. And what is that? It's everything. It's everything that we are, everything that we have, all that we do belongs to God. And so it's this really amazing response that Jesus has when he's put into an either or scenario. He kind of just transcends the question and he brings it to an even higher level. And so he, as we've seen before, he kind of answers the question without really answering the question, but he does it in a way that brings the discussion, that elevates the discussion to something even bigger than whether or not we should pay taxes. And it's something to think about for us when we're put in those kind of situations as well, where it's a yes or no and either or, where there's kind of this dilemma of maybe it's our faith, something that we hold strong to, or, the culture of the company we work for, or the culture of the house that we live in, or the culture of the neighborhood that we're a part of, asking us to do something else. How does our faith guide us in those questions? Do we submit to kind of the either or trap that we may be put in, or is there a way that we can respond to transcend those questions as well, to bring the discussion to something even higher? So he moves on from there. He kind of, as I said, he basically wins that battle, and they disperse, right? They've lost their attempt to arrest him because he kind of just turned the tables on them. And so another group comes up, the Sadducees, and they have a question for Jesus. Verse 18 here, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow, but he also died, leaving no child. It was the same with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. So in the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her? Jesus replied, Are you not in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God? When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now, about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken. You are badly mistaken. I think I'm going to start ending more of my interactions with my kids with that phrase. You are badly mistaken. Just like the way that resonates. The Sadducees come. So the Pharisees, the Herodians, they've had their turn at trying to put Jesus in a bind and get him to say something stupid. Now the Sadducees come. They're another religious group that is known really for what we see there in that first verse of the section, is that they do not believe in the resurrection. That's kind of one of the things that define that group. Well, they were a wealthy class, and one of the suggestions for why they didn't believe in the resurrection was that if people believed that there was something in the next life waiting for them, if they would be, something better than the life they're living now, if they would act righteously, and that might disturb kind of the power structure that the Sadducees, the structure of wealth and power that they have set up, that they're benefiting from in this life. And so to teach someone, well, hey, if you act righteously and boldly and courageously in this life, you'll be rewarded in the next life. Well, that might encourage people on the bottom not to tolerate abuse and oppression and things like that. And so to teach people that, no, this is your life, this is the lot that you have, you just need to kind of endure it, there's nothing waiting for you in the next life, was kind of something that helped keep them stable at the top in the wealthy class. So the Sadducees come, and again, just like the Pharisees and the Herodians, they're not looking to get into a learning situation with Jesus here. They don't believe in the resurrection, and they're asking questions about the resurrection. It'd be like me going to a flat earth conference and asking questions about the flat earth. Well, I'm really there just to kind of ridicule the people. And that's really what the Sadducees have come to do, is to ridicule Jesus and his followers for believing in the resurrection. So they bring up this kind of ancient code, what's called levirate marriage, which all of the research shows that Israel never really practiced this, but this was in the book of the law, this idea that if a man marries a woman and does not bear any children, does not have any heirs, well, then the man's brother, it's his responsibility to then marry the widow and produce children who would be seen as the heirs of the older brother. Okay, so that way the land and all the possessions could continue passing through the family. So it was this idea that if your brother died, it was your responsibility to go produce children on his behalf with his widow. So they kind of bring up this really ridiculous image of 7 brothers all marrying the same woman, none of them having any heirs, and they get to the resurrection, and the question is, well, so who gets to marry the widow in the afterlife? Because there were 7 of them. And Jesus responds again kind of with 2 parts of the question. Jesus first responds and kind of breaks apart their whole question by saying, look, you're imagining that the resurrection life is basically the resuscitation life, that it's just a continuation of the way that things have always been. And that's not what the resurrection is. In the resurrection, Jesus says, there is no marrying, there's no giving in marriage. You will be like angels in heaven. Basically, his response is to say that life in the resurrection is not just a better form of the life that you're living now. Life in the resurrection is beyond this life that you're living now. It's something that is completely transformed and different. And we can think about situations where we might wonder the same thing, where we have a lot of situations today where widows and widowers get married again and then they die. Well, then which of those 2 partners are they with in heaven? Well, I think Jesus would say in the resurrection, it's not like things just continue on as normal. In the resurrection, everything is perfected. All of your relationships are made whole. Everything is transformed and beyond. So Jesus kind of just really quickly dismantles their whole question and says, you don't even understand what you're talking about. But then he comes back at them, knowing that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection at all, and tries to kind of give this proof text for why they should. He goes back to again, the book of Moses, the book of the law, and kind of picks out this really little verse that I don't know that anybody would have ever read and thought, well, this is proof of the resurrection, and says that God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Basically saying these people who in your mind are in the past, in God's mind, they are in the present. They continue to live in a way. So Jesus dismantles their question about what the resurrection will be like, but then he kind of pushes back at them and says, your scriptures that you hold so tightly to speak of the resurrection. God is the God of the living, not the God of the dead. And so the resurrection life is exactly what God is intending. And so again, another group of people have come to kind of put Jesus in this bind to trap him. Jesus does away with them. And then someone who was kind of on the outskirts watching this whole scene and appreciating what Jesus is doing is one of the first to actually come forward and ask an earnest question in hopes of dialoguing and learning with Jesus. And this picks up here in verse 28 here. One of the teachers of the law. So again, this kind of a good reminder that really you can't generalize any of the groups in the Bible. The Pharisees, it's easy to pin them as the enemy. Well, Nicodemus in the Gospel of John is a Pharisee and is one of the ones who actually, it's that conversation with Jesus where we get that beloved verse, John 3:16, that God so loved the world that he gave his son. And Nicodemus is one of the ones who actually comes and gets Jesus's body to bury him after the crucifixion. So we can't categorize everybody all together. This is a teacher of the law, and most of the teachers that we've seen so far have been opposed to Jesus. But here one comes forward and asks an earnest question. One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked them, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Well said, teacher, the man replied. You're right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to them, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. So this one teacher of the law comes forward and essentially is asking Jesus, if the Bible were on fire, if the Torah were on fire, what do you grab and save, right? What's the most important thing that we, God's people, need to know and follow about God? And Jesus responds really kind of the way that most teachers, most rabbis at the time probably would have responded with the Shema, which is a prayer that the Jews would have prayed every single day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Shema just means hear. So it's the first word in that prayer that they would be praying. And we would have thought that that's where Jesus would have stopped, because the man asked for one great commandment. What's the greatest commandment? And Jesus responds with really kind of what any Jew would have responded at the time, that the Lord your God is one. But then he continues and he says the second is like this. So it's kind of 1 and 1A for Jesus. These are two things that in Jesus' mind are so intricately linked that you really can't even separate them into two commandments. They're really together. They work to become, in Jesus' mind, what is the most important part of God's teaching of the law, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so you can think of what Jesus is saying here. And the man responds and says, that's great. That's kind of exactly what I was going to say. And he adds on this little addendum and says, all of that, loving God and loving your neighbor, is better than all of the burnt offerings and sacrifices. And Jesus, you can kind of imagine Jesus smiling and appreciating that this guy has actually gotten what Jesus has been trying to do with his whole ministry. And you can think about all of the little laws and things that Jesus has really been breaking his whole ministry. Laws about the Sabbath, laws about the way that you eat your food, not washing your hands ritually before eating your food, the kind of people that you keep company with, all of these laws that Jesus has been in the minds of the teachers of the law, the Pharisees and the opponents, has been breaking. Jesus has been saying, but I have been keeping the two most important commandments, which is loving God with my whole heart and loving my neighbor as myself. It's kind of that idea that when you're making a cake, you have the cake and you have the icing. Everything else is just decoration. It doesn't really matter how great the sprinkles are if the cake and the icing are rotten. And Jesus is kind of saying here in this that people have been placing way too much importance and emphasis on the sprinkles on the cake instead of the actual cake itself. Love God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I was thinking a lot about this as I was reading, how this pandemic that we are living in is really narrowing our focus for our own faith, because so much of the rituals and traditions that we have been participants in and that we rely so much on in our week-to-week life, especially coming to church and gathering together, are things that we are not able to do anymore, at least for this season. And this idea of Jesus saying, look, every morning when you wake up, there's really only two things you need to strive to do. Love God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And these are two things that more than any time in our life, perhaps, that we can put our whole energy behind, because all of the sprinkles of our religion have kind of been removed from our life. And so how are we loving our neighbor? How are we loving God in this season when we're really kind of kept from all of the other parts of our faith that we have been so used to having in our life week to week? It's a question to think about over these last 3 weeks. What are the elements of your faith that have become more meaningful or have become less meaningful? Things that you used to rely totally on that now you can't do those things. How are you finding more meaning in your faith as all of those sprinkles of our religion have been kind of taken off of the plate? So Jesus has responded now to two groups of enemies who try to trap him. He's had a good dialogue with someone who's actually really interested in growing in the faith. And now nobody has any questions for him. So Jesus asks one more question of himself, really as a way to kind of put a cap on his whole ministry and remind everybody who he is and what he has come to do. And this is here in verse 35. While Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, why did the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." David himself calls him Lord. So how then can he be his son? A large crowd listened to him with delight. So again, we have Jesus pulling out one kind of one tiny piece of scripture that really I don't think anybody would have read and thought that this was a word about the Messiah until Jesus raises it here from one of the Psalms. And the Psalms were at that time especially attributed entirely to David. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, look, when David wrote about the Messiah in the Psalms, David referred to the Messiah as Lord, not as my son, not as my descendant, not as someone who is an heir and a lesser inheritor to what I built, but David, the king, refers to the Messiah as someone who is superior to him. So this is kind of Jesus' way again of reminding the crowds, don't forget that I am the one you've been waiting for. But then there's also this kind of twist too, because all along the way, when people have been expecting the Messiah in Jesus to do certain things and Jesus hasn't done them, this is also kind of Jesus's way of reminding them that I'm not the kind of Messiah that maybe you were expecting. I'm not the Messiah that I'm not doing all of the Messiah things you thought the Messiah would do, because the Messiah is not just a descendant of David. It's not going to look just like David. The Messiah is actually something above David, something completely different than David. And so this is kind of putting a cap on the ministry, reminding everybody, I am the one who is promised, but I'm not going to carry things out the way that you have been expecting them to be carried out. And then we have this final scene in the temple before Jesus steps outside to teach his disciples one last time and eventually to be arrested. He has this final scene where he's speaking to the disciples, and Verse 38 here, it says, as he taught, Jesus said, watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on. So we come to kind of this closing scene here where I said at the beginning, I think is really kind of a real life manifestation of the parable that he talked about at the beginning of the vineyard. And those who had been put in charge of the vineyards, the tenants, the stewards, who really were the teachers of the law, the community leaders, the wealthy, the religious leaders, those people who were supposed to be good stewards of the kingdom. We see them appear here again at the end, and Jesus is chastising them, right? Beware the teachers of the law who like to dress in flowing robes and get the best seats at the banquets and offer lengthy prayers or offer lengthy Zoom teachings, and they will be punished most severely, Jesus says, right? And that kind of reminds us back to what he said in the beginning of the parable. What is the punishment is the tenants will be punished most severely, and the kingdom will be given to other people. And then we have this kind of final image of Jesus sitting, watching people bringing their offerings forward, and he sees these wealthy people, these teachers, these folks who were supposed to be leading and caring for all of the nation of Israel, who amassed all of this wealth for themselves, giving great amounts, but amounts out of really kind of their spare change into the temple treasury. And then he sees this widow come forward, someone who would have been disregarded, who would not have even been noticed, comes and brings these 2 small coins, everything that she owns, and puts them in the temple treasury. And Jesus is essentially saying she is the one who has loved the Lord with all of her heart, all of her mind, all of her soul, all of her strength. She has given everything for God. And it's kind of Jesus's way, I think, of kind of wrapping up that idea about the vineyard, of saying these are the ones who on the outside look like they're the ones who are living with the blessing of God because they've got the wealth, they've got the influence, they've got the power. But let me warn you, the kingdom of God is being taken from them and given to those who are actually living out the kind of self-sacrificing life that God calls all of us to live. And it's a way too of kind of really kind of previewing what he is ultimately going to give, which is his full self. He is going to give fully his life for the sake of others on the cross. And this is how Jesus kind of wraps up his public ministry here, with this image really of kind of taking these 2, the people who were put in charge of caring for the kingdom and the people who were supposed to be taken care of. And Jesus puts them together and says, God is going to take care of the widow. The widow is the one who's actually living the way that God has called each of us to live. And that is who is going to get the reward of the kingdom of heaven. So this is how the public ministry wraps up. Starting the next chapter, which David will pick up next week, we get to the apocalypse, and we finally move into the arrest and kind of the ending of the gospel. So we've got 3 questions here for you to break up into your small groups and to do together. And again, thanks for being with us this morning. God bless you guys.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and break you into groups. I'm